Welcome to our October Planet Possible MiniPod. I'm Nikki Roach and this is our monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. And it's a MiniPod because it'll only take about 15 minutes of your time and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. And each MiniPod I'm joined by an environmental expert and we explore 3 issues that are making the headlines, keeping you right up to date with what's happening around the world and where my guest sees exciting possibilities. We're joined today by a familiar voice to MiniPod listeners, biodiversity reporter for the Guardian newspaper, Phoebe Weston. And we'll be talking about health and the biodiversity crisis happening in our bodies, the historic news that renewable energy has overtaken coal for the first half of 2025 to meet energy demand, and changing migratory patterns for birds. So welcome to the MiniPod, Phoebe. It's great to have you back with us. Let's start by hearing about your article on human health and microbiodiversity. I love that word. What does it really mean and what did you discover?
The microbiome is essentially the biodiversity that lives on your body. So it's viruses, fungi, bacteria and other microbes. Quite a good way of thinking about it is your body as a kind of city. And these are the micro citizens that live inside it. And we often think of viruses as something bad, but these citizens are absolutely essential to our health. And listeners probably will have heard about gut microbiomes, lots of interest in gut microbiome, but there's microbiomes all over the body. There's the vaginal microbiome, it's on our skin, we have it in our nose, ears, eyes, and all of these little communities are slightly different in those different places. And they're all serving a really important job of keeping us healthy and balanced. So helping us digest food, for example, fighting off harmful germs. They can impact your mood. They're really important to the immune system. The reason why I was looking at this is because the biodiversity crisis and the destruction of the world's biodiversity. But there's also an internal biodiversity crisis happening in our own bodies because of poor diet. So processed food they think is bad for your microbiome. Also taking antibiotics too readily, also antiseptic creams. And also the thing I'm really interested in and what I've been reporting on and was lucky enough to go to Finland to report on this, was looking at the link between the environment, our wider environment, and our internal biodiversity, because there's this constant exchange between the bacteria, fungi and viruses that live in our wider environment, in the natural environment, which we as humans were designed to thrive in, that then enrich us. As people become increasingly distant from the natural world, it could be that it's having quite important impacts on our health.
So we talked a little bit about biocides with Baroness Natalie Bennett, who joined us earlier on this year. That was more around regulation of biocides because of the impact that we were starting to see. I mean, why did you go to Finland? What was happening over there?
In their daycare centres, they're doing some incredible research trying to measure the health impacts of being in a healthy natural environment. The government's given these 43 daycare centres funding to rewild their yards. In Finland, they have a totally different approach to childhood and the importance of access to nature, specifically these daycare centres. They've got wetlands, there's soil everywhere, there's lots of vegetable gardens encouraged, so the kids are really digging their hands into the soil. There's sand pits everywhere with enriched sand, so there's additional bacteria in the sand. The thing which struck me the most was that they had transported 10 metres squared of Finnish forest into the daycare centre that I visited, and it was covered in berries, and the idea was the kids could sort of forage on this little bit of Finnish forest, and it was quite surreal because this daycare centre was built on a car park. It was amazing. It was so cool. These researchers had gone in to take samples over the course of a year of these kids' saliva, faeces and skin to see whether there was a link in rewilding the yard and increasing the bacteria, viruses and fungi that are living on their skin, i.e. their microbiome. The results showed that basically the kids had less disease-causing bacteria on their skin, they had stronger immune defences, they found a reduction in a specific type of bacteria in the gut microbiota, and that bacteria is associated with inflammatory bowel disease, sepsis, botulism, and they also found an increase in T cells in the blood, again, which protect the body from autoimmune diseases. So it was pretty compelling as in terms of the health benefits these kids were getting. And of course, we know already that kids benefit from being outdoors, But this goes a level deeper. You know, it's like getting under the skin of how this can impact them from a health point of view.
All right, let's move from nature to climate for our second story. So this is something that I've come across in the news. It's been on a combination of BBC News, there's been some surveys that have just come out and a little bit in The Guardian. It's a positive one, which is nice to share with you. So as we're kind of heading into COP30 in Brazil in November, there's a bit of realism in there, but globally we are seeing electricity demand grow. Doesn't sound that positive, but in the first half of 2025 the demand increase was met by renewable energy and it took over as the leading source of electricity. And this is research from the global energy think tank called Ember. Solar and wind is, you know, what we're seeing more of, and actually that meant that we saw less coal and less gas in use. And as a reminder, if we need one, coal in 2024 was the largest individual source of energy generation and obviously contributes to kind of global heating. Solar did the lion's share, so solar met 83% of the increase in electricity demand, and it's now been the largest source of new electricity globally for 3 years in a row.
Was there any geographically, like in terms of which countries are leading the way and which countries are the laggards in terms of going renewable?
Yes, and I think it's really interesting because it starts to then play into kind of the politics of climate. So we talked in our last Planet Possible with Zach Goldsmith around the Conservative Party thinking they might want to scrap the Climate Change Act, and actually you start to see even some of this climate scepticism coming through. So China leading the way with green energy growth. Its fossil fuel generation reduced by 2% in the first half of this year. It's adding more solar and wind capacity than the rest of the world combined. Similar trends in India, but the demand isn't growing as fast as China. But in the US and in the EU, the opposite's happening. So they're in what's called the wind belt rather than the sun belt. So obviously we don't have as much hours of sunshine, and the performance of wind has not been as good in the first half of this year. So we've seen actually increased coal and increased gas generation. And in the US, demand just grew too fast. They couldn't keep up. And actually, I read a piece, interestingly, from one of your colleagues, Oliver Millman, in The Guardian, just recently, that said that data centre power consumption in the US by 2030 will be at 14% of US total energy demand. I talked on the pod about like the water consumption that also goes alongside data centres. So 14% of all the energy that will be needed in the US is needed for data centres in the next 5 years.
And you said that there'd been a growth in demand in the US. Was that from data centres, existing data centres? Is that a trend that's already happening?
There's a general view that data centres should try and be water neutral, but that's not the case at all. And it's the same, you know, from an energy perspective. I think we just don't always recognise the amount of photos we store on our phones, every time we run ChatGPT and it uses a litre of water, but also the energy demand. All of this is kind of growing in what feels like a relatively uncontrolled and unconsidered way for us as consumers. We're just using it. So another unintended consequence of some of this, though, that I thought was fascinating was in Afghanistan, they've now started to get solar powered water pumps, which feels great, but because they are much more efficient than the previous pumps that they had, because they've now got reliable energy, they're reducing the water table to a point where they think in the next 5 to 10 years it will be unsustainable. Solar has rapidly decreased in cost, so it's much more affordable, but there's unintended consequences with all of this. Good news generally, but then as you start to get underneath the skin of those national trends, some interesting changes, I think.
This is part of a trend. It's not, this year's not just a blip in terms of, wow, that was a really great year. This is something that's we can expect to continue.
It's a really interesting question because from what I have seen and read, the view is actually that the renewable forecasts are not looking as positive for the rest of the next 5 years, the rest of the decade. So the International Energy Agency halved its forecast for the growth of renewables for the US from 500 gigawatts to 250, with a view that that's kind of a reflection of the current US administration's general policies. But nevertheless, fingers crossed, it's a big turning point, and particularly for low-income countries, for them to be able to be more sustainable for energy, I think. Good news, really. Right, let's talk finally about your other news article on migratory patterns for birds changing. Tell me what you're seeing.
It was so hard to do because you get into bird migrations and every bird has the most incredible story, how they get from A to B, the stops that they use on the way. I mean, they're such fragile and ancient journeys that they're taking. They are under increasing pressure. We were looking at how things like climate change and habitat destruction makes these epic journeys even harder. One bird we were looking at is the nightingale, obviously a British favourite, which migrates down to Weston area of sub-Saharan Africa. And these little birds have a 6,000 kilometre round journey and they weigh the same amount as a large strawberry. and they really have to stock up on their fat reserves before they go. So nightingales, they've declined by 90% in around 50 years in the UK. So like absolutely calamitous destruction of their habitat, which has driven these population declines. They like these scrubby woodland habitats, and we're destroying them in the UK. We followed the story of one male bird who we named Berkeley, who'd been tagged by researchers from BTO, and they basically could track his journey right down to Senegal. And we looked at all the threats that face him on the way, for example, increasing droughts and wildfires in Europe. His stopover points, which are really important in terms of refueling, are less available to him because of these environmental conditions. And so this journey is becoming more perilous. When he gets to Western Africa, the area of land they're relying on has been subject to decades of drought. There's also increasing exploitation of these scrubby forest habitats for wood from local populations. So essentially, he's sort of struggling with habitat destruction both in the UK and down in sub-Saharan Africa where he overwinters. I'll just briefly touch on another one. So the Berwick swan typically migrated down to sort of northern Germany, the Netherlands and the UK to overwinter, but because of climate change, they're doing this thing called short stopping, where they basically don't need to go as far south because the climate is warmer. And these researchers, again, have put GPS tags on these birds and discovered that they do it in quite an ad hoc way. Like they'll wake up in the morning and decide how far to fly that day. And if it doesn't get cold enough, they just won't move further south. The modelling showed that if a winter was 1 degree colder, the birds would spend on average 75 miles further southwest. So as winters get warmer, they're just shifting north.
It's such an interesting indicator, isn't it, of what's actually happening at the moment. Like right now, it's not a thing that's happening in the future, it's happening right now. And actually, I read your article when it came out, and I particularly loved the story about the petrels and just that they're basically storm chasers.
Yeah, the desertus petrels are chasing hurricanes over the Atlantic. You might think that's quite an odd thing to do, and I definitely did. But the reason they do it is because these hurricanes, they feed on deep sea fish and squids, which are obviously brought up to the surface. These petrels don't dive down deep, they're surface feeders. And the joy of a hurricane is that it brings up all this cold, rich water from the bottom. And so they find that there's a glut of food after a hurricane. So they will fly for, one of them flew for just shy of 12,000 kilometres over a period of 3 weeks, hunting this one particular hurricane, which again we mapped in the article, feeding, and then went back to its chick, and it creates this lovely fishy oil from 3 weeks at sea and then regurgitates it for it to feed its chick. It's absolutely amazing. They think it's one of the largest foraging movements known to the animal kingdom, the distance that bird will travel to find food for its young.
And there are only like 200 breeding pairs left.
Very fragile population.
I think that's the word. I think you said at the beginning, very fragile, very beautiful. It strikes me as exactly that. These are indicators that are extremely sensitive and extremely fragile. And anyone that knows me will know that I could talk about birds forever. But we probably should wrap up just because we've reached the end of the mini-pod. But I will make sure that we put links in the show notes to the 2 articles that you have written, Phoebe, and people can go and have a bit more of a look. Thank you for joining us, Phoebe. As ever, you've given me loads to think about and I'm utterly inspired. And thank you to you for joining us for the mini-pod as well. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode, and we love to hear your ratings and reviews too. We've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, and our next episode is all about heat networks, so I hope you'll join us for that too. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guest, as ever, Phoebe Weston. Thanks for joining me, Phoebe.
Thanks so much, Nikki. Pleasure to be on, and look forward to the next one.
That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.